Angela arrived at the office at 9 p.m., her arms full of coffee and snacks to get through the long night. The office was eerily quiet, its usual buzz replaced by a heavy stillness. Rows of empty cubicles stretched into the darkness, illuminated only by the occasional flicker of fluorescent lights. Her task was simple: reconcile financial reports and prepare them for the morning meeting. Angela sighed, placing her bag on her desk and booting up her computer. As the hum of the machine filled the air, she felt a pang of unease. "You've done this before," she whispered to herself, forcing a smile. Hours passed uneventfully. The rhythmic clicking of her keyboard was the only sound in the vast, empty space. Around midnight, she decided to stretch her legs and grab another cup of coffee from the break room. As Angela walked past the rows of cubicles, she thought she heard something, a faint tapping sound, like fingernails drumming on a desk. She stopped, her heart pounding. "Hello? Is someone there?" Silence. Shaking her head, Angela chuckled nervously. "Get a grip, Ang. It's just your imagination." But as she poured her coffee, the tapping resumed, louder this time, and it seemed to be coming from her desk. Returning to her desk, Angela found nothing out of the ordinary. The tapping had stopped, and the office was as still as before. She sat down, trying to focus on her work, but the unease lingered. Then, out of the corner of her eye, she saw movement. A shadow flitted across the wall, too large and too quick to be a trick of the light. "Hello?" she called again, her voice trembling. Her desk phone rang, startling her so badly she nearly fell out of her chair. Who could be calling at this hour? She picked up the receiver, her hand shaking. Angela speaking. There was no reply. Just static at first, then a faint whisper. "Get out." Angela slammed the phone down, her chest heaving. "This isn't funny," she shouted, her voice echoing through the empty office. Determined to prove to herself that it was all in her head, she decided to check the security footage. The cameras were located in a small room near the entrance, monitoring all areas of the building. The security room was dimly lit, the monitors casting a pale glow. Angela scrolled through the recordings, her unease growing as she saw nothing unusual. Then she noticed it. On one of the feeds, the camera overlooking her desk, a figure stood behind her chair, a tall, shadowy shape that didn't move. Angela's blood ran cold as she rewound the footage. The figure had appeared suddenly, materializing out of thin air. And then, just as suddenly, it was gone. She checked the live feed, her eyes darting between the screens. Her desk was empty. Breathing heavily, Angela grabbed her phone and considered calling the police, but what would she say? That she saw a shadow on a screen? They'd think she was crazy. Deciding to gather her things and leave, she turned toward the door and froze. The figure was standing in the hallway, its face obscured, its form unnaturally still. Angela's instincts screamed at her to run, but her legs felt like lead. She blinked, and the figure was gone. She bolted for the elevator, her heart pounding in her ears. As she mashed the button, she heard footsteps, slow, deliberate, and getting closer. When the elevator doors finally opened, Angela rushed inside and hit the ground floor button. The doors began to close, but not before she saw the figure again, standing at the end of the hallway. This time she could make out its eyes, black, empty voids that seemed to pull her in. The elevator descended, but the lights flickered. Come on," she whispered, clutching her phone like a lifeline. The elevator stopped suddenly, the doors opening to reveal the same floor she had just left. "No," she whispered, backing into the corner. The figure stepped into the elevator, its presence overwhelming. The air grew cold, and Angela's breath came out in visible puffs. The figure didn't move or speak, but Angela felt its intentions: malice, anger, and a hunger she couldn't comprehend. Summoning every ounce of courage, she shouted, "What do you want from me?" The figure raised an arm, pointing at the building's entrance. Angela didn't need to be told twice. She sprinted past it, her body fueled by sheer terror. Bursting through the front doors, She didn't stop running until she reached her car. As she sped away, she glanced in the rearview mirror and saw the figure standing in the lobby, watching her leave. Angela quit her job the next day, unwilling to step foot in that office again. But the nightmares followed her. In her dreams, she was back in the building, the figure always just out of reach. Sometimes she woke to find her phone ringing, the same static-filled whispers greeting her. She eventually learned that the office building had a dark history. A former employee had taken his own life after being wrongfully accused of embezzlement. His desk? The one Angela had been working at that night. To this day, Angela refuses to work night shifts, and she avoids empty offices at all costs. Malik clocked in at 10 p.m., waving to the security guard at the gate. The warehouse was massive, with towering shelves stacked high with boxes, creating a labyrinth of metal and cardboard. He liked the solitude, but something about that night felt off. The air was unusually heavy, and the faint hum of the industrial lights sounded more like a low growl. As he walked to his workstation, he noticed a few items scattered on the floor. Strange, as the place was usually immaculate. He picked them up, muttering about careless coworkers, and went on with his duties. Around midnight, while checking inventory, he thought he saw something move out of the corner of his eye. A shadow darting between the aisles. "Hello?" he called out, his voice echoing in the vast space. No response. Shaking it off, he returned to his task, but the feeling of being watched grew stronger. Then came the noise. A faint scratching sound, like nails on metal, coming from the far end of the warehouse. Malik grabbed a flashlight and walked cautiously toward the sound. The sound led him to a corner of the warehouse that rarely saw any activity. It was darker here, the overhead lights flickering sporadically. As he approached, the scratching stopped. His flashlight beam swept over the boxes, revealing nothing unusual. But as he turned to leave, he heard a loud bang behind him. Whipping around, he saw one of the boxes had fallen off the shelf, spilling its contents onto the floor. Papers, old files, and a single photograph lay scattered. Picking up the photo, Malik felt a chill run down his spine. It was a black and white picture of a man in a warehouse uniform, staring blankly at the camera. "What the hell is this doing here?" he muttered, shoving it back into the box. As he straightened up, he felt a gust of cold air pass by him, followed by the unmistakable feeling of someone standing behind him. Malik spun around, but there was no one there. His heart aced as he hurried back to his workstation. Trying to shake off his nerves, he focused on sorting boxes. But the scratching sound returned, louder this time and closer. "Okay, enough of this," he said, grabbing his phone to call the security guard. Before he could dial, his phone's screen went black. Frustrated, he looked up and froze. A figure stood at the end of the aisle. It was tall, its form barely illuminated by the flickering lights. "Hey, who's there?" Malik shouted, his voice trembling. The figure didn't move or respond. Instead, a voice echoed through the warehouse, low and guttural. "Leave. You don't belong here." Malik's legs felt like jelly, but he managed to whisper, "What do you want?" The figure stepped closer, and Malik realized it wasn't walking, it was gliding. Panic overtook Malik as he ran toward the exit, his flashlight bouncing wildly in his hand. But no matter how far he ran, the aisles seemed to stretch endlessly. He stopped to catch his breath, leaning against a shelf. The silence was deafening, broken only by the sound of his ragged breathing. Then a deep laugh echoed through the warehouse, followed by the voice again. "You can't leave." Suddenly, boxes began toppling from the shelves around him, as if an unseen force was throwing them. Malik ducked and dodged, narrowly avoiding a heavy crate that crashed inches from his head. Desperate, he tried to retrace his steps to the entrance, but the layout of the warehouse seemed to have changed. The aisles twisted and turned in ways they never had before, creating a maze he couldn't navigate. After what felt like hours of running, Malik stumbled into an open area of the warehouse. In the center stood the figure, clearer now under the flickering lights. It was the man from the photograph, his face pale and distorted, his eyes hollow and black. "Why are you here?" Malik demanded, trying to mask his fear. The man's voice was filled with pain and anger. "This is my place. They took everything from me. Now no one leaves." Malik's mind raced. Was this a ghost? A spirit tied to the warehouse? He remembered the files in the fallen box and the photo of the man. "Who are you?" Malik asked. The figure tilted its head. "I was like you, worked here. They blamed me for a fire I didn't start. I lost everything. Now, I take everything back." Malik's heart sank. The warehouse fire, he'd heard about it in passing but never paid attention. "I'm sorry for what happened to you," Malik said, his voice softening. "But I'm not the one who hurt you. Please let me go." The spirit seemed to hesitate, its form flickering like a dying flame. For a moment, Malik thought it might let him go, but then the spirit snarled. "No one leaves!" The lights in the warehouse exploded, plunging everything into darkness. Malik dropped to the ground, covering his head. When he looked up, the figure was gone. The lights flickered back on, and the warehouse was silent once more. Malik didn't waste another second. He sprinted to the exit, his heart pounding in his chest. Outside, the security guard looked up from his desk, startled. "Hey, what's wrong?" Malik didn't answer. He drove home and quit his job the next day. Later, he looked up the history of the warehouse and found an article about the fire. The man in the photo had indeed been accused of causing it, but he died in the blaze before he could clear his name. To this day, Malik avoids warehouses, especially at night. He knows he was lucky to escape, but he'll never forget the voice that still haunts his dreams. "You can't leave." The factory was an enormous structure filled with conveyor belts, assembly stations, and the endless hum of machinery. Clara's job was straightforward: monitor the packaging line and ensure everything ran smoothly. The night started as usual. She clocked in at 9 p.m., greeted the skeleton crew, and headed to her station. There were only 3 other workers on duty: Mark, a technician, Sandra, a quality checker, and Greg, the janitor. Around 11 p.m., Clara noticed something odd. One of the conveyor belts stopped suddenly, halting the line. She called Mark over to check it out. "It's strange," Mark muttered, examining the belt. "The system says it's running fine." As he tinkered with the controls, Clara glanced around. The factory felt colder than usual, and the usual hum of the machines seemed softer, almost distant. Once the belt was fixed, Mark left to attend to another issue. Clara returned to her post, but a nagging feeling of unease lingered. At midnight, Clara took her scheduled break. She grabbed a coffee from the vending machine and sat in the break room. The room had a large window overlooking the factory floor. As she sipped her coffee, she thought she saw movement near the far end of the factory. A shadow flickered past the machines. "Must be Greg," she mumbled, though her heart raced. She stood up and peered through the glass. The shadow moved again, this time darting between the rows of equipment. "Hey, Greg," she called, but her voice echoed back unanswered. Feeling uneasy, she decided to return to her station early. On her way back, she stopped abruptly. One of the machines started up on its own, its loud clanking breaking the eerie silence. She approached cautiously, her footsteps echoing in the vast space. The machine stopped just as she reached it. The factory's power suddenly flickered, plunging the space into near darkness. Emergency lights cast long, unsettling shadows across the room. "Mark? Sandra? Is anyone here?" Clara called out, her voice trembling. A faint whispering sound reached her ears. She couldn't make out the words, but it was coming from a small office at the far end of the factory, a room that was always locked. Gathering her courage, Clara walked toward the office. The whispering grew louder, interspersed with faint tapping sounds. When she reached the door, she found it slightly ajar. Her heart pounded as she pushed it open. The room was empty, save for a dusty desk and a single chair. On the desk lay an old, yellowed photograph. Clara picked it up and gasped. The photo showed a group of workers standing in front of the factory smiling. But there was something off about one of them. A man at the edge of the group with unnaturally dark eyes and a blank expression. Suddenly, the door slammed shut behind her and the whispering stopped. Clara tried to open the door, but it wouldn't budge. She banged on it, calling for help, but no one came. Then, she felt it, a presence in the room. The air grew icy, and the hair on her arms stood on end. Turning slowly, she saw him. The man from the photograph stood in the corner, his dark eyes fixed on her. His expression was devoid of emotion, but his presence radiated malevolence. "Why, are you here?" Clara stammered. The man tilted his head, as if considering her question. Then, in a voice that sounded like a mixture of whispers and static, he said, "They took it from me. My life. My future. Now I take theirs." Clara backed away, her hand fumbling for the door handle. "I don't know what you're talking about." "They know," the figure said, pointing toward the factory floor. "And you will too." The door suddenly flew open, and Clara stumbled out, falling to the ground. Terrified, Clara ran to find Sandra and Mark. She found them near the control room discussing the flickering power. "There's someone here," she shouted. Mark frowned. "What are you talking about?" She told them about the man in the photograph. Mark's face paled. "There's an old story," he said hesitantly. "Years ago, a worker named Peter was fired after an accident on the line. He claimed it wasn't his fault, but management didn't believe him. He took his own life in the factory." Sandra added, "Some say his spirit never left. People have seen things, shadows, heard whispers, but nothing like this." Clara insisted they leave, but Mark wanted to check the office. When they returned, the photograph was gone. Despite her protests, the team decided to finish their shift. Clara stayed close to Mark, too scared to be alone. Around 3 a.m., the machines began malfunctioning one by one. The lights flickered wildly, and the whispering returned, louder than ever. Then Peter appeared. He stood in the center of the factory, his dark eyes glowing. "Leave!" he roared, his voice echoing like thunder. Mark tried to reason with him, but Peter's form grew larger, his shadow stretching across the factory floor. Objects flew through the air and the machines went haywire. Clara grabbed Mark and Sandra, screaming, "We need to go." As they ran toward the exit, the ground beneath them trembled. The factory seemed alive, pulsating with Peter's anger. They barely made it outside before the entire building plunged into darkness. The next day, Clara quit her job and never looked back. She later learned that the factory was shut down after repeated reports of strange occurrences. Though she escaped, Clara knows she'll never truly forget the man with the dark eyes, the silent watcher who still haunts the factory.